"Grandma, forgive me. I took too long to understand." Why did the grandmother secretly sew dresses? Years later, the granddaughter discovers a devastating secret, and her heart will never be the same. Why would someone spend countless hours sewing the same piece of clothing for someone who didn't want to wear it? When the last stitch was made, love overflowed, but time could no longer be reversed. The night in the small village was silent, broken only by the rhythmic sound of the needle piercing the fabric. The old lantern flickered on the wooden table, casting wavering shadows on the rustic walls of Margaret's home. Her hands, marked by time and hard work, guided the needle delicately as the thread danced between her trembling fingers. In the corner of the tiny room, Sophie slept soundly, curled up under a worn wool blanket. Her chest rose and fell gently, keeping pace with the peaceful breathing of the 5-year-old girl. The little blue dress Margaret was sewing rested on her lap, almost finished. She sighed, adjusted her glasses on her face, and continued. Each stitch was a gesture of silent love, a sacrifice that no one saw but was woven into the fabric with the same patience she applied to her life. Outside, the cold wind sliced through the dry fields surrounding the village. Winter was merciless, and Margaret knew she couldn't leave her granddaughter without proper clothing. Still, the dress was not just a piece of clothing. For Margaret, each thread interwoven was a promise of protection. By morning, the pale sun emerged between the hills, spreading a faint light across the village. The rooster crowed, and Margaret was already up, her apron tied around her waist, ready for another day of work. Even before Sophie woke up, she had lit the wood stove and set the water to boil. The work was hard, but she never complained. Every morning she washed clothes for the wealthier neighbors, scrubbing thick fabrics in the stone basin until her fingers felt numb. The wet clothes weighed like lead, and the cold water made her joints ache. Between each piece, she paused to catch her breath, the persistent cough tightening her chest. But she never spoke of it. Sophie didn't need to know. By noon, while Margaret mended an old coat on her porch, Sophie ran up to her, holding a drawing she had made. The childish lines depicted 2 figures holding hands in front of a small house. "This is me and you, Grandma," the girl said, her eyes shining. Margaret smiled, stroking her granddaughter's hair. "It's beautiful, my dear. And this lovely house is ours?" "Yes, and I drew flowers because one day I want to plant a big garden for you." Grandma pulled the girl into a warm embrace, feeling the comforting heat of that hug. "A garden, huh? I would love to see that happen." Sophie nestled beside her, watching as her grandmother threaded the needle through a small piece of blue fabric. "Grandma, why do you always sew these dresses?" Margaret paused, looking at her granddaughter with a serene smile. "Because each stitch has a story, my dear. And one day, when you grow up, I want you to look at them and remember me." The girl frowned, not quite understanding those words. For her, dresses were just clothes. But Margaret knew that time would teach her to see beyond the surface of things. Afternoon fell, and the sky turned orange. Margaret returned to her small room, where she kept a sewing box filled with colorful fabrics. The savings were few, but she always set aside a little change to buy cheap scraps at the market. The wind picked up, and the cough came stronger this time. Margaret leaned on the table to catch her breath, her chest burning in protest. Sophie, who was playing at the door, turned at the muffled sound of the cough. "Grandma, are you okay?" Margaret quickly wiped her lips with a handkerchief and forced a smile. "I'm fine, dear, just a silly cold." The girl ran to her, hugging her tightly. "You can't get sick, Grandma. Otherwise, who will tell me stories before bed?" Margaret closed her eyes for a moment, savoring the warmth of that embrace. She ran her fingers through Sophie's soft hair and kissed her forehead. "I will always be here to tell you stories, my angel. Always." Later that night, after Sophie had fallen asleep, Margaret returned to her rocking chair and picked up the unfinished dress. She looked at the fabric between her fingers and, with a sigh, resumed sewing. Her eyes filled with tears as she thought about the future. Sophie was only 5, but she was clever and full of dreams. One day, she would leave that village in search of something greater. And Margaret knew that when that day came, all she would have left were the dresses she had sewn, hoping her granddaughter would never forget where she came from. She placed her hand over her chest, feeling the subtle pain that had been with her for months. There was no time to think of herself. Her only wish was for Sophie to have a better life. The clock struck nearly midnight when she finished the last stitch on the blue dress. She sighed with relief and folded the piece tenderly, placing it on the table. Before extinguishing the lantern, she cast one last glance at her granddaughter, sleeping peacefully. "One day, you will conquer the world, my girl," she whispered, "and I just want to be here to watch." Outside, the wind blew strong, swaying the trees and carrying away the echo of words she never imagined she wouldn't be able to say one day. Time passed silently, like the wind sweeping across the dry fields of the village. Years transformed Sophie from a curious child into a 15-year-old girl, her eyes carrying both the sparkle of dreams and the shadows of uncertainties. The village, however, seemed unchanged. The same wooden houses, the same dirt roads, the same feeling that time moved too slowly there. Margaret, on the other hand, had no time to notice the changes around her. Her routine had become even more exhausting. In addition to the laundry she did for neighbors and the mending she took on to earn a few coins, she now accepted cleaning jobs in the nearby city. Each day, her steps grew heavier, her breath shorter, but she never complained. Sophie was the reason for it all. The girl had shown herself exceptionally talented in her studies, and her teachers at the village school, aware of her potential, had secured her a scholarship at a larger school in the neighboring city. It was a rare opportunity, almost unbelievable for someone in her position. But with the scholarship came expenses: transportation, materials, better clothing. Margaret stretched herself even thinner to cover these costs. The house felt smaller now, not because the walls had shrunk, but because Sophie had grown. Her hands no longer held the colorful scraps she used to play with while her grandmother sewed. Instead, they now gripped heavy books, filled with difficult words that she devoured with quiet determination. On a cold morning, Margaret woke before the sun rose, as she always did. Her muscles ached, and a tight pressure gripped her chest, but she ignored it. She quickly dressed and left for work, leaving a small bundle of bread and coffee on the table for Sophie. The girl woke shortly after, smelling the faint aroma of the drink. She looked at the bundle but didn't touch it. She grabbed her backpack and hurried out to catch the bus to school in the city. The hallways of the new school were long and bright, filled with confident voices and soft laughter. Sophie walked with her eyes wide open, trying to absorb everything around her without seeming out of place. Academically, she excelled, but socially, she felt like a stranger in that environment. Her classmates wore expensive clothes and talked about trips they had taken and parties they had been invited to. "You're from the village?" a girl asked one day, wrinkling her nose as she noticed the reinforced stitching on Sophie's uniform sleeve. "Your clothes look old," Sophie smiled, as if the comment hadn't stung her, but inside she felt a discomfort. "My grandmother is a seamstress," she replied, trying to sound indifferent. "Oh, how cute," another girl said, in a tone that didn't quite sound like a compliment. Slowly, Sophie began to notice the differences between herself and the others. While her classmates talked about brand-name clothing and the latest electronics, she avoided the subject. When they asked about her home, she would deflect the conversation. Margaret, however, still believed that Sophie didn't care about these differences. To her grandmother, the girl was strong, independent, proud of who she was. But as the months passed, small signs began to emerge. One afternoon, while sewing a new dress for Sophie, Margaret looked at her granddaughter and smiled. "I made this especially for you. Wear it to school tomorrow. I want you to feel beautiful." Sophie examined the fabric with a neutral expression. The dress was simple, a deep blue with small hand-stitched details. Beautiful, but... "Thank you, Grandma, but you don't have to." "You don't like it?" "It's not that. It's just that it doesn't match me anymore." Margaret blinked several times, as if she didn't fully understand. For a moment, the silence between them stretched. Then, with a tired smile, the grandmother folded the dress and set it aside. "That's all right, dear. I'll keep it for another occasion." Sophie felt a tightening in her chest, but said nothing. She didn't want to hurt her grandmother, but she also didn't want to wear a dress that made her feel different. At school, she avoided talking about her home in the village. When someone asked, she would respond vaguely, without lying, but without giving details. Did she feel ashamed? Perhaps. But she didn't want to admit that, even to herself. Rebecca, the longtime neighbor, noticed these changes. She saw how Margaret was working harder, even as her body showed clear signs of exhaustion. "You need to rest more, Margaret," Rebecca said one night, seeing her sitting on the porch with her hands massaging her chest. "You're pushing yourself too hard." "What else can I do?" Margaret replied with a weak smile. "She has a chance. I can't let the world swallow her before she's ready." Rebecca sighed. "But at what cost? You can barely sleep, you hardly eat, right?" Margaret didn't respond. Instead, she returned to sewing. The sound of the needle piercing the fabric filled the silence between them. Sophie began to spend more time outside. She had studies, extra work at the library, and sometimes accepted invitations for small get-togethers with classmates. Margaret waited for her every evening with a warm plate of food, but sometimes Sophie came home late, having already eaten something in the city. Margaret never said anything. She simply put the plate away, and when Sophie went upstairs to her room, she would sit for a few minutes at the empty table, looking at the cold remnants of food on the plate. One weekend, Sophie was invited to a party at a classmate's house. It wasn't a lavish event, but still, it was a social gathering she wanted to be part of. When Margaret asked where she was going, Sophie hesitated. "Just a get-together with some friends." "Do you want me to sew something special for you?" "You don't have to, Grandma. I already have something to wear." It was the first time Margaret realized that Sophie was avoiding her clothes. That night, while Sophie was at the party, Margaret went to her granddaughter's room and opened the wardrobe. Inside, carefully folded, were all the dresses she had sewn over the years. None of them had been worn recently. She closed the wardrobe doors slowly, feeling something tighten in her chest. It wasn't just the fatigue of that hard life. It was the realization that perhaps Sophie was starting to drift away. The next morning, Sophie rushed down the stairs, grabbing her backpack to leave. "You didn't have breakfast, dear." "I'm late, Grandma. I'll eat something at school." Margaret held the edge of the table, feeling a slight dizziness. Sophie! The granddaughter looked back. Yes? For a moment, Margaret wanted to say something, to ask if she still felt proud of where she came from, if she still saw the dresses as more than just pieces of fabric. But instead, she smiled. Take care of yourself, my dear. Sophie smiled back, but there was something distant in that smile, something Margaret couldn't decipher. The day passed slowly. When night fell, Margaret lit the lamp and picked up a new fabric. Even knowing that it might never be used, she would keep sewing. Because that's what she always did. And because, deep down, she still hoped that Sophie would come to see what she had never stopped seeing. But time was running out, and neither Margaret nor Sophie realized just how much. Margaret does everything for Sophie. But will the young girl realize the value of this love before it's too late? If you're enjoying this story, please like, comment, and subscribe to the channel. It really helps us bring more emotional stories like this. Now, let's continue Sophie's journey. Thank you for watching. The night crept slowly over the village, and the sound of the lamp burning was the only noise that filled the small room where Margaret sewed. The fabric slipped between her trembling fingers, the needle piercing each stitch with delicacy and precision. Deep in her chest, she felt fatigue accumulating like an invisible weight, but her mind was far away from there. She was thinking of Sophie, of everything the girl would achieve. And then the news arrived. Sophie burst through the door, breathless, clutching a crumpled envelope with the seal of Greenhill University. Her heart raced so loud she could hear it in her own ears. Margaret, seated in the rocking chair, set her sewing aside and watched her granddaughter with curiosity. "What is it, dear?" Sophie took a deep breath, trying to contain her excitement, but her eyes sparkled with joy. "I got in, Grandma. I got into Greenhill University." For a moment, the world seemed to stop. Margaret blinked several times, letting the words settle in her mind. Then, a wave of emotion washed over her, and her eyes filled with tears. "My girl, you did it," she whispered, rising slowly. Before Sophie could say anything, she felt her grandmother's frail arms enveloping her in a tight hug. She inhaled the scent of cotton and thread, the scent of the home where she had grown up, the scent of everything she knew. And for a moment, everything was perfect. The news spread quickly through the village. Neighbors, friends, and even strangers came to Margaret's little wooden house to congratulate her. Someone brought a simple cake. Another brought coffee, and that night, Margaret's home was more crowded than it had been in years. But behind the smiles and congratulations, a shadow loomed over Margaret. She knew that the scholarship covered only part of the costs. The rest would depend on sacrifices that, at that moment, only she understood she would have to make. In the following days, as Sophie filled out paperwork and planned her move, Margaret had already made her decision. Without Sophie knowing, she sold a portion of the family land that had belonged to them for generations. It was a modest piece, but enough to ensure that Sophie had what she needed to start her life in Greenhill. Rebecca, the neighbor, was the first to notice the change. "Are you sure, Margaret? That land has always been everything to you." "Now my Sophie is everything to me," replied the grandmother, folding the sale contract with trembling hands. "And your health? You need to think about yourself, too." Margaret smiled but said nothing. The truth was that she had felt her body failing for some time, but there was no time for doctors, not when Sophie needed her. It was the next day that Andrew appeared. The boy, who had studied at the same school as Sophie, had also gotten a place at Green Hill. But unlike her, Andrew didn't have to worry about money. His family had resources and was already organizing his move. He found Sophie at the village grocery store while she was buying a new notebook. "So you're really going to Green Hill?" he asked, with a smile that sounded more like a taunt than a compliment. Sophie nodded. "Yes." Andrew laughed, grabbing a package of cookies from the shelf. "I can't imagine how someone from the village will survive there. It's another world, you know? Are you sure you'll be able to fit in?" Sophie clenched her fists, feeling heat rise to her face. She wanted to respond boldly, but instead forced a smile. "I'll manage." Andrew shrugged. "I hope so. If you need any tips on how not to seem out of place, just let me know." He winked and left, leaving Sophie with a knot in her throat. That night, when she returned home, she found Margaret sitting on the porch, sewing in the light of the lamp. "I'm making a gift for you," said the grandmother without looking up. Sophie approached and saw what it was, a dark blue dress, elegant yet simple. "For what?" "To take with you to Green Hill, for when you miss home." Sophie forced a smile but felt a weight in her chest. "Thank you, Grandma." But the truth was, she didn't know if she would wear that dress. The next morning, as she folded her clothes into the suitcase, she noticed there was little space. The dress made by Margaret lay on the bed, waiting to be packed. Sophie hesitated. She picked up the dress, felt the fabric between her fingers, but in the end, she folded it carelessly and placed it at the bottom of the suitcase. She went down the stairs and found Margaret preparing breakfast. The grandmother coughed lightly, holding onto the edge of the sink for support. "Grandma, have you thought about going to the doctor?" Margaret turned, smiling. "And spend the money for your university?" "No, dear. You need it much more than I do." Sophie frowned. "But what if it's something serious?" Margaret wiped her hands on her apron. "Nothing that a good cup of tea won't fix." Sophie sighed. "Promise me that after I go to Green Hill, you'll take care of yourself?" Margaret smiled and nodded. "Of course, my girl." But Sophie didn't know that promise was empty. The day of departure arrived faster than Sophie imagined. The suitcase was ready. The bus was already waiting on the dusty road that led to the city. Margaret held her granddaughter's hands, her gaze filled with pride and anticipatory sadness. "I always knew this day would come," said the grandmother, her voice choked. Sophie felt her eyes burn. "I don't want to leave you alone, Grandma." "My love, go. This is my dream, to see you shine." Sophie hugged Margaret with all her strength, inhaling the familiar scent of thread and soap that clung to her apron. "I love you, Grandma." "And I love you more." When Sophie climbed onto the bus and looked out the window, she saw Margaret there, smiling, small, fragile, but full of love. The engine roared, and the bus began to move. Sophie felt her chest tighten. Something inside her screamed to get off, to stay. But instead, she simply closed her eyes and let Green Hill call her away. The bus jolted slightly along the road that led away from the village, carrying Sophie toward a completely new world. Her heart still felt heavy from saying goodbye to Margaret, but the excitement of arriving in Green Hill, finally entering university, and experiencing the life she had always dreamed of, kept her awake. When she stepped off at the bus station, she felt small in the shadow of the towering buildings that surrounded her. The bright lights of neon signs flickered in vibrant colors, cars sped by, and the bustling chatter of people talking and rushing made her chest thrum with a mix of excitement and nervousness. The village where she had grown up seemed a distant world now. Taking a deep breath, she adjusted the strap of her bag and followed the directions she had received. She would take a taxi to the student residence, where she would share a small apartment with 2 roommates. The driver hardly spoke to her as he drove through the wide avenues, and Sophie gazed out the window, both fascinated and frightened. Chic cafes, designer store displays, expensive restaurants. Well-dressed people walked the streets, clutching luxurious shopping bags, laughing together as if that was the only world that mattered. She didn't belong there. When she arrived at the building, she struggled to pull her suitcase inside and entered the modern reception area. The elevator took her to the 3rd floor, and her heart raced as she saw the door that indicated her new home. She knocked hesitantly and was greeted by a young blonde woman with straight hair and a friendly expression. "Ah, you must be Sophie. I'm Melanie. Welcome." The other roommate, a girl with brown skin and stylish glasses named Claire, appeared right behind her, smiling. "Finally, someone to share this chaotic space with us. Come in. Come in." Sophie smiled, trying to mask her discomfort. The apartment was modern, decorated with minimalist furniture. There was a white leather sofa in the living room and an integrated kitchen with appliances that looked as if they had never been used. Her room was small but had a comfortable bed and a built-in closet. As she unpacked her suitcase, she found the dress Margaret had made for her. She picked it up carefully, feeling the simple fabric between her fingers. It was so different from the clothes she saw in the girls' closets. Taking a deep breath, she folded the dress and stuffed it deep into her suitcase under the other clothes. The next day, her routine began. Sophie visited the university to take care of paperwork and pick up her materials. She quickly learned that although she had received a scholarship, she still needed to pay for books, transportation, and food. Money would be an issue. She found a small campus cafe that was hiring and got a job as a waitress in the morning shift. The pay wasn't much, but at least it would cover the basics. Her first day was exhausting. She served coffee, cleaned tables, and listened to complaints from rushed customers. When she finally left in the late afternoon, her feet ached, but there was a quiet pride in managing on her own. That was when she heard a familiar voice. "You work here?" She turned around and saw Andrew leaning against the wall, arms crossed. He wore an expensive coat and designer sneakers, a stark contrast to her simple cafe uniform. "Yeah," she replied, trying to sound indifferent. He chuckled softly. "Well, someone has to serve coffee, right?" Sophie felt her cheeks flush. "It's an honest job." Andrew raised his eyebrows as if he found her response amusing. "I know. I'm just saying I didn't expect you to need to work. I thought your grandmother was supporting you." She bit her lip. He had no idea what Margaret had sacrificed for her to be there. "I'm managing," she said, ending the topic. Andrew gave a half-smile and looked around. "Listen, there's a party at a friend's house tomorrow. You should come. It could be a chance to meet people, the right kind of people." Sophie hesitated. Part of her knew she didn't belong in Andrew's social circle, but another part wanted to prove to herself that she could fit in. "Maybe," she replied. "Great, I'll send you the address." And then he walked away, leaving Sophie alone with her doubts. That night, when she got back to the apartment, she found Melanie and Claire on the couch, watching a movie. "You look exhausted," Claire commented, pulling her legs up to make room for Sophie. She flopped onto the couch with a sigh. "First day of work. It was tough." Melanie frowned. "You work?" Sophie hesitated for a second. "Yeah, at a cafe near the university." "Wow, I didn't even imagine that," Claire said, grabbing a handful of popcorn. "I thought your family—" I don't know that you came from a more well-off background. Sophie laughed awkwardly. Oh, yeah, but it's always good to have some extra cash, right? She avoided looking at the suitcase where her grandmother's dress was hidden. Days turned into weeks, and Sophie began to avoid talking about her life before Greenhill. When people asked where she was from, she would simply say she grew up in the countryside, without many details. She avoided mentioning Margaret. She avoided talking about the village. Her calls with her grandmother became shorter. Margaret called every night, her voice heavy with longing. "How are things going, my girl?" "Fine, Grandma. Everything is going well." "Are you eating properly?" "Yes, don't worry." She lied. She didn't always have money for a decent meal, but she didn't want Margaret to worry. "Are you wearing the dress I made for you?" The question caught Sophie off guard. She looked at her closed suitcase and lied without thinking. "Yes, Grandma, I wear it all the time." Margaret sighed on the other end of the line. "That makes me happy." After the call, Sophie felt like garbage. Time passed, and she began to feel a subtle change within herself. Even though she was trying hard to fit in, there was a constant weight in her chest. The dress from Margaret was still there, at the bottom of the suitcase, a silent reminder of what she was trying to ignore. Then came the day of the party. Andrew picked her up in his car and took her to a luxurious house in the city center. The loud music echoed down the street, and the interior was filled with wealthy people chatting and laughing with glasses of wine in hand. Sophie walked among them, feeling like an imposter. She tried to smile and interact, but everything felt superficial. That was when she overheard a conversation behind her. "Did you see the girl who came with Andrew?" "Yeah. He said she came from a village in the middle of nowhere. She must be pretending to belong to this world." Sophie's blood ran cold. She shouldn't have come. She hurried out to the balcony, taking deep breaths. Her heart raced. She felt her phone vibrate in her pocket. It was Margaret. For a moment, she considered ignoring the call, but something inside her compelled her to answer. "Grandma!" Her grandmother's voice was weak. "Hi, my girl, is everything okay?" Sophie looked around at the lavish party, at the people laughing as if the whole world belonged to them. And for the first time since arriving in Greenhill, she felt lost. I don't know, Grandma." Margaret smiled on the other end of the line. "It's okay to feel that way, my dear. Just don't forget who you are." The call ended, and Sophie stood there, gripping her phone tightly. She felt a tightness in her chest, an inexplicable fear. Something was wrong, but she still didn't know what. Sophie still held her cell phone against her chest, her breathing unsteady, as the loud music and conversations around her felt like distant noise. Something in Margaret's tone, a vulnerability that hadn't been there before, sent a shiver down her spine. But, as had become a habit, Sophie shook her head and forced herself to ignore that strange feeling. She went back inside the house, forcing a smile as she passed by the guests, as if she hadn't just felt a weight on her chest. She found Andrew leaning against a marble counter, holding a glass of whiskey and chatting with other students. When he saw her, he raised an eyebrow and patted the space next to him. "For a moment, I thought you had run away." Sophie forced a laugh. "I just needed some air." Andrew studied her for a moment, his sharp gaze too perceptive for her liking. Then he smiled and tilted his glass toward her. "Enjoy it. You finally belong in this world." Sophie wanted to believe that. She wanted to convince herself that this was where she was meant to be, that there was no more room for the village in her life. In the following days, however, reality crashed down on her like an avalanche. The money Margaret sent had drastically decreased, and for the first time, Sophie realized that perhaps her grandmother had nothing left to sell. When she did the month's calculations, she saw that she wouldn't be able to pay rent without doubling her shifts at the cafe. "Are you sure you can handle working that much?" Melanie asked, watching her with concern as they studied in the apartment's living room. "I have no choice," Sophie replied, flipping through the books without really absorbing anything. The feeling of suffocation grew. The cafe was always packed, the customers demanding, and the boss impatient. Sophie barely slept, rushing between work and classes, maintaining the facade that everything was fine. Her university classmates continued going to lavish parties, dining at expensive restaurants, and weekend getaways. Andrew always insisted she join them, and Sophie, even knowing she didn't belong to that world, sometimes accepted because it was easier to pretend than to face the truth. It was on one of those nights that she received a call from Rebecca. "Sophie, your grandmother isn't well." The voice on the other end sounded weary, as if trying to control the concern. "She hasn't gone to the market or the fair this week." Sophie squeezed her eyes shut, feeling the pressure in her chest rise. Maybe she's just tired. You know how she is. She doesn't like to rest." "Sophie," Rebecca insisted. "She's different. She's weaker, and I know she doesn't want to worry you, but maybe you should come see her." Sophie looked around. She was at Andrew's house, sitting on a leather sofa while others laughed and drank in the background. The contrast between those two realities felt like a punch to the gut. But she couldn't go back now. It was exam time at the university, and the professors wouldn't give any second chances. "Rebecca, I can't leave right now. It's a complicated moment. But tell her I'll call tomorrow, okay?" The silence on the other end of the line was heavy. "All right, Sophie." When she hung up, she felt the knot in her throat tighten, but she pushed the feeling away and returned to the conversation with the others, trying to ignore the discomfort inside her. Weeks passed. Sophie continued lying to herself, saying she would go back as soon as the exams were over, that everything would be fine. Then a package arrived in the mail. It was a simple box tied with worn twine. When she opened it, Sophie felt her stomach churn. Inside were fabrics, scraps of cloth that Margaret used to sew. There was a note on top, written in her grandmother's careful handwriting. "My girl, these fabrics have accompanied me for many years, but my hands can no longer work as they used to. Maybe you can sell them. Maybe you can make something beautiful with them. I know you're clever and will find a way. With love, Grandma." Sophie squeezed the paper between her fingers, the words weighing like lead on her heart. Margaret would never stop sewing of her own accord. She knew what that meant. Yet even so, she didn't catch the first bus back home. The following days were a blur. Sophie tried to focus on her studies, on work, but every time she closed her eyes, she saw Margaret's note. She felt the soft fabric between her fingers. Rebecca called a few more times. Sophie answered less than she should have. The excuses piled up. Then, one day, while finishing her shift at the cafe, she saw something that made her blood run cold. A photo on Facebook. An acquaintance from the village posted an image of Margaret sitting in front of the house, wrapped in a shawl too thin for the season's chill. In the background, there was an empty space where the piece of land she had sold once stood. The caption read, "The strongest lady I've ever known. She never complains, but I think she's tired." Sophie felt her legs weaken. For a moment, she couldn't breathe. Margaret looked smaller, more fragile. And she wasn't there. She dropped her cell phone on the table and rushed out of the cafe, her mind spinning. The weight of guilt crushed her chest. She had to go back. But what if it was already too late? Sophie's cell phone vibrated on the table. She glanced at the name on the screen and hesitated for a moment before answering. "Rebecca?" The muffled crying on the other end made her stomach churn. "Sophie," Rebecca's voice faltered. "It's your grandmother. She's in the hospital." The world seemed to freeze around Sophie. "What? What happened?" "She collapsed at home. I went to bring her some soup and found her on the floor. Sophie, she's so thin. And I found out she hasn't bought her medications in months. She used everything to send you money." Sophie's breathing became erratic. No, that can't be true. "You need to come now. I don't know if she—" Rebecca swallowed hard. She didn't finish the sentence. The ground felt as if it had vanished beneath Sophie's feet. She stood up suddenly, knocking over her chair. The cafe was bustling, customers laughing and chatting, but the sounds faded into the background, distant, as if she were underwater. "I'm coming," she said, hanging up without a second thought. She dashed to the back of the cafe, ripped off her apron, and threw it on the counter. "Sophie," her manager called, "where are you going?" She didn't look back. She burst through the door, her lungs burning, tears pooling in her eyes as she hurriedly typed in the bus schedule. She needed to go. She needed to go now. She pushed open the apartment door and grabbed her backpack, stuffing in some clothes and her phone. Her hands shook so much that she almost couldn't zip it shut. As she stepped outside to hail a cab, she heard a voice behind her. "What's with the rush?" Andrew leaned against the hallway wall, arms crossed, a sarcastic smile on his face. Sophie didn't respond, just kept walking. "Sophie, wait up!" he insisted, trailing behind her. "What happened?" She turned around, her heart racing, and said with a trembling voice, "My grandmother is in the hospital." Andrew raised his eyebrows. "Oh." Sophie waited for some kind of genuine reaction, but Andrew just shrugged. "And you're going to drop everything to run to a village at the end of the world?" She blinked, dazed. "What do you mean? Of course I'm going." He sighed and fiddled with his designer watch. "Sophie, you've worked so hard to get out of that place. It doesn't make sense to go back now, especially for a—" He paused for a moment, but Sophie knew exactly what he was going to say. "For an old woman who has lived too long." Rage exploded inside her, quick and hot. "How can you say that?" Andrew rolled his eyes. "Because it's true. You're killing yourself trying to fit in, to be someone. What do you think will happen if you go back to that hole? You'll end up just like her." "I can't believe you're saying this." "I'm just being realistic, Sophie. You don't belong there anymore." She stared at him, incredulous. All this time, she had wanted so much to be part of Andrew's world. But now, she saw clearly who he really was. "You know what? You're pathetic," she spat the words. "I would much rather be like my grandmother than like you." She turned her back and ran for the taxi, not looking back. On the bus, as the city lights blurred into smudges on the glass, Sophie gripped her phone tightly. Her heart hammered in her chest. With trembling fingers, she opened Margaret's message box. The number of unheard voice messages made her stomach churn. Putting on her headphones, she pressed play on the first one. "Hi, my girl. I just wanted to know if everything's okay there. I know life in the city must be busy, but I wanted to hear your voice." Sophie closed her eyes, a tear rolling down her cheek. She tapped on the next one. "I made a new dress. I know you said you don't need it anymore, but, well, I just wanted to make it anyway." Her throat tightened. Another audio. "I hope you're eating well. I saw a new recipe and wanted to try it for when you come to visit. You'll come soon, won't you?" Another. "It's getting cold here. I made a scarf for you. I'll send it by mail." Another. "Sophie, please respond when you can, okay?" The last audio was a tired whisper. "I miss you, my girl." Sophie covered her mouth with her hand, stifling a sob. The bus cut through the empty road, the darkness outside reflecting the emptiness that was growing inside her. She remembered her childhood, the nights she heard the sound of the sewing machine, her grandmother's wrinkled hands holding hers when she was scared to sleep alone. How could she have been so blind? Hours later, the first light of morning began to appear on the horizon. When the bus finally stopped at the village station, Sophie felt her legs tremble as she stepped down. The air was different, colder. The town seemed smaller than she remembered. She hurried through the dirt streets, her heart racing, until she spotted Rebecca at the hospital entrance. The neighbor's face looked worn, her eyes red-rimmed. When Rebecca saw her, something in her expression broke. Sophie ran. "How is she?" Rebecca hesitated. "Sophie, she." Sophie grabbed the neighbor's arms, desperation rising in her throat. "Where is she?" Rebecca pointed inside. Without thinking twice, Sophie dashed through the hospital doors. Her feet pounded against the linoleum floor as she ran down the hallways. She needed to see her. She needed to say everything she hadn't said. Time seemed to run out with each passing second. Sophie thought she always had time to return until the worst happened. Margaret is in the hospital, and now everything might change. If this story has touched your heart, subscribe to the channel, turn on the notification bell, and leave a comment. It really helps the channel grow. Now, let's see if Sophie can still make things right. Thank you for watching. Sophie ran down the hospital corridor, her eyes blurred with tears. The strong smell of disinfectant and the muffled sound of respiratory machines created a suffocating atmosphere. Her heart hammered in her chest as she passed through the worn doors, desperately searching for the only person who mattered at that moment. When she finally entered the small room, her feet froze to the ground. Margaret lay in bed, her fragile arms at her sides, connected to a simple respirator and a heart monitor that beeped with each passing second, like a cruel countdown. The room was modest, the sheets thin and faded, and beside the bed was a small table with a glass of untouched water. Sophie felt her throat tighten. Her grandmother seemed smaller than she remembered. The white hair fanned out on the pillow, the skin even paler under the dim ceiling light. "Grandma," she whispered, her voice breaking. She approached slowly, feeling her legs tremble. The sound of the heart monitor seemed to grow louder, each beep drilling deep into her chest. Rebecca paused in the doorway, hesitant. "She arrived here very weak, Sophie. The doctor said she needed specialized treatment for months." Sophie swallowed hard, her eyes fixed on her grandmother's frail figure. But why? Why didn't she seek treatment before? Rebecca lowered her head. "Because she used everything she had for you." Sophie blinked, feeling the weight of those words. "What?" Rebecca stepped closer, holding a worn envelope in her hands. She extended it to Sophie, who took it with trembling fingers. When she opened it, she found receipts, old papers, notes. Each one was evidence of what Margaret had sacrificed to support her in Green Hill. She sold the rest of the land, sold furniture, sewed until her hands couldn't take it anymore. All to send you money, so you could keep studying without worrying about her. The weight of those words fell on Sophie like an avalanche. Her knees buckled, and she grasped the edge of the bed to keep from falling. No, this can't be. Rebecca looked at her friend with sadness. She never wanted you to know. She said the only thing that mattered was your future. Sophie felt her heart crack. Every memory surged cruelly to the surface. All the times she had ignored calls, all the unread messages, all the lame excuses for not returning to the village. She held her grandmother's cold hand, tears streaming silently down her cheeks. "Grandma, it's me, Sophie," she sobbed, squeezing the frail fingers between her own. "I'm here. Please, listen to me." Margaret did not move. Only the weak breathing and the intermittent sound of the heart monitor filled the room. Sophie shut her eyes tightly, her chest ablaze. "I'm sorry. Please, I'm so sorry." The knot in her throat made it hard to breathe. Rebecca knelt beside her, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "Sophie!" But she couldn't hear anything but the guilt screaming inside her mind. "I shouldn't have left. I should have stayed." She lowered her head onto her grandmother's hand, letting the tears flow freely. "I would trade everything, Grandma, everything, just to go back in time." It was then that she felt a slight squeeze. Sophie froze. She slowly lifted her head, and her heart almost stopped when she saw Margaret's eyes partially open, her mouth trying to form words that wouldn't come out. "Grandma!" Sophie exclaimed, gripping her hand tighter. "I'm here! It's me!" The elderly woman's mouth moved slightly, but her voice was just a weak whisper. "Don't try to talk, please. Just stay with me." Margaret's gaze, even weak, still carried the same love as always. A love that never changed, even when Sophie pulled away. She wanted to say something. Sophie leaned in closer, trying to listen. The dry lips of her grandmother parted just a bit more. "My girl." Sophie held back a sob. "Yes, it's me, Grandma." Margaret's breathing was labored, each breath seeming like a struggle. "I always believed in you." The pain tore through Sophie's chest. "And I disappointed you." Margaret's eyelids began to droop, and panic washed over Sophie. No, don't sleep now, stay with me." She looked desperately at Rebecca. "We need to do something." Rebecca bit her lip. "The doctor said there's not much that can be done here, Sophie. She needs a bigger hospital, but—" "I'll find a way," Sophie shouted, suddenly rising to her feet. She pulled out her cell phone, trembling hands dialing numbers. "I'll get an ambulance. I'll find a hospital. I'll find the money." She stormed out of the room like a whirlwind, not thinking, not breathing. She started calling every doctor she knew in Greenhill, every hospital, every bank. "I need to transfer my grandmother immediately," she said in every call. But all the answers were the same. "Without insurance. The fees are too high. There are no available beds for transfer." Despair washed over her. Rebecca found her outside the hospital, her eyes wide, her face pale. "Sophie." "I'll sell everything I have," Sophie interrupted, her voice firm. "I'll sell my computer, my clothes, my phone. I can get the money. I just need time." Rebecca looked at her with a heavy heart. "Sophie." "I can't lose her, Rebecca, I can't." Silence fell between them for a moment. Sophie felt the cold wind of the night against her skin, and for the first time, she realized how dark it was. Time was running out for her. And inside that hospital, in the small room with faded sheets, Margaret was still fighting to breathe. But for how much longer? The silence in the hospital was shattered by a piercing alarm coming from Margaret's room. Sophie felt the air leave her lungs. Time seemed to slow down as she turned her head and saw the heart monitor's screen flickering erratically. The insistent beeping intensified, and the numbers plummeted rapidly. No! No, no, no! She rushed into the room as doctors and nurses flooded the cramped space. Margaret trembled slightly, her chest heaving, breaths coming in gasps. "Grandma!" Sophie cried, gripping her grandmother's cold hand. The medical team struggled to stabilize her, fighting against the inadequacy of the equipment. Sophie felt her heart crush inside her chest when a nurse called for more adrenaline and someone brought a defibrillator. "We're losing her!" "Do something!" Sophie shouted, her nails digging into her grandmother's pale skin. "Please, she can't die!" The words echoed in the room, but Margaret did not respond. Sophie looked at her grandmother's face and saw how her expression began to relax, as if all the pain were slipping away. No. She couldn't be leaving. "Charge the paddles now!" A doctor placed the defibrillator pads on Margaret's frail chest, and her body arched. Sophie stifled a scream, her eyes wide, waiting, pleading for a sign, any movement, anything. The monitor flickered. Then a flat, unyielding line. Come on again!" The shock was repeated. Sophie held her breath, but the monitor did not change. "No!" she screamed, her throat tearing. "Try again! Please, try again!" The doctors exchanged grim looks as silence began to weigh heavily in the room. "Doctor," a nurse murmured. Sophie felt the doctor's eyes on her, but her focus was on the one person who mattered in that moment. "No," she repeated. "Don't give up on her." The desperation in her voice was palpable, powerless. But then, the most terrifying sound filled the room. A long, continuous beep. Sophie felt her legs give way. No, it couldn't be real. The doctor sighed and lowered his head. The time of death, 3:42 a.m. Sophie's eyes widened, her heart faltering in her chest. Time stopped. Her mind screamed that this couldn't be happening, that someone would burst in and say it was a mistake, that her grandmother was still there. But Margaret did not move, did not breathe. The fingers Sophie held were cold. The hand that was once so strong, so loving, so full of life, now lay lifeless. "Grandma!" Her voice came out as a whisper. But there was no answer. Her chest no longer rose and fell. The silence in the room became deafening. "No!" Sophie's scream was a roar of pain. She lunged toward her grandmother, gripping her shoulders, shaking her gently, as if the simple act of calling could bring her back. "Please, don't leave me, please!" Desperation consumed her body. She sobbed uncontrollably, her face pressed against her grandmother's still chest. Margaret would never again open her eyes. Would never again call Sophie my girl. Would never again hold her in her arms. The knot in Sophie's stomach tightened like a crushing chain. She didn't have the chance to say what she needed. Couldn't ask for forgiveness. The pain tore through her chest from the inside out, a sharp guilt, a devastating regret. All that Margaret had done, every night spent sewing, every cent saved, every sacrifice. And Sophie hadn't been there. The truth crashed down on her like an avalanche. She could never fix this. Rebecca found her minutes later, curled on the floor of the room, sobbing helplessly. "Sophie!" Her friend knelt beside her, but Sophie merely shook her head, her eyes fixed on the bed where Margaret now seemed only an empty shell. I can't. She could barely form words. Rebecca closed her eyes, trying to contain her own tears. The doctor cleared his throat, his voice somber. If she had started treatment on time, maybe we would have had a chance. Sophie felt a wave of nausea wash over her. She knew. She knew that was true. It was then that Rebecca pulled out a package tied with a thin cord and placed it on Sophie's lap. "She asked me to give this to you." Sophie blinked several times, as if her brain couldn't process that information. With trembling hands, she held the package, feeling its weight, feeling what it represented. She tugged at the knot, and the cord came undone. The paper unfolded slowly. And then Sophie saw. Inside the package was an unfinished dress, the thread still attached to the needle. Her eyes filled with tears. On the delicate stitches of the fabric, something was embroidered. She took a deep breath, swallowing the sob that threatened to escape, and ran her fingers over the letters stitched into the fabric. "If one day I am no longer here, remember that every stitch I made was a hug I wanted to give you." Sophie felt the world collapse around her. She pulled the dress against her chest, her crying now uncontrollable, raw, desperate. And then she realized it didn't matter what she did from then on. The time she lost, the words she didn't say, the hugs she didn't give. Nothing would bring Margaret back. Nothing would erase the weight of that guilt. She would never have the chance to fix her mistake. The silence in the room intensified. Rebecca placed a hand on her shoulder, but Sophie was too deep in her own pain to feel anything but the overwhelming emptiness. And as she held that last piece of her grandmother, she understood that what remained now was to live with that void forever. The silence in Margaret's small house was suffocating. The air carried the weight of absence, a void that spread into every corner like a cold shadow. Sophie still held the dress against her chest, as if the mere touch of the fabric could bring her grandmother back. But there was nothing more, just the sound of her own ragged breath, her body weak from crying. Outside, the people of the village began to arrive for the wake. Neighbors who had known Margaret all her life, simple folk coming to pay their respects, many carrying small flowers picked from their gardens or folded fabrics, in homage to the woman who had, for so many years, mended clothes and stitched dreams. Rebecca entered the room quietly, stopping in the doorway at the sight of Sophie kneeling beside the bed. "It's time, Sophie," she said, her voice gentle yet firm. Sophie didn't respond immediately. She just took a deep breath, trying to gather her strength. She felt empty, as if part of her had been torn away forever. Slowly, she stood up, still holding the unfinished dress. "She spent her whole life taking care of me," she whispered. "And I wasn't even here when she needed me the most." Rebecca approached, placing a comforting hand on her shoulder. "What matters now is what you do with that," she said softly. Sophie closed her eyes, trying to swallow the knot in her throat. Outside, the village gathered in the small church for the ceremony. The simple coffin rested on the altar, surrounded by humble flowers, the mournful faces reflecting the loss of someone who had touched everyone's life. "Your grandmother never complained," said an elderly neighbor to Sophie. "Even on the hardest days, she said it was all worth it because you were studying." Another man who managed the local market held Sophie's hand. Margaret always put others before herself. When she was sick, she refused help. She said she had something more important to do. Now I understand that something was you. Each word was a blow to Sophie's chest, a cruel reminder of how much her grandmother sacrificed for her to be in Greenhill, distant, pretending to be someone she wasn't. The ceremony continued with heartfelt speeches. Sophie remained silent, feeling incapable of speaking. All the while, she held the unfinished dress, as if that were the only thing connecting her to her grandmother at that moment. When it was all over, the village dispersed slowly. Only Rebecca stayed by Sophie's side, accompanying her back to the house that now felt too empty. Sophie wasn't sure what to do. The world around her felt distant, as if she were trapped in a gray, soundless dream. She slowly climbed the stairs and entered Margaret's room. The familiar scent was still there, a mix of herbal tea and the old fabric of her sewing. With trembling hands, she sat on the bed and opened the package Rebecca had given her at the hospital. Carefully, she untied the cord and unwrapped the paper. Inside was the unfinished dress, the thread still attached to the needle, as if Margaret had stopped in the middle of sewing, waiting to finish later. Sophie's eyes filled with tears when she noticed something else. There was a small pouch sewn into the lining of the dress. With hesitant fingers, she ripped open the delicate seam and felt a weight fall into her hands. Folded notes. Margaret's last savings. Every cent she had saved, even when she had nothing left. Sophie sobbed, the pain cutting through her chest like sharp knives. She held the dress against her face, inhaling the scent of Margaret embedded in the fabric. And then she saw the embroidery in the lining. My Sophie, the love I felt for you doesn't need an ending. Her vision blurred with tears. Her chest ached, a deep, crushing, irreparable pain. The words embroidered there were a silent embrace. And Sophie crumbled. She fell to her knees on the bedroom floor, her fingers gripping the fabric, her cries coming in uncontrollable waves. Each time she had rejected the dresses. Each time she had lied, saying she wore them. Each time she had ignored her grandmother's calls. Now she understood. Now she saw what Margaret had always tried to say. Now it was too late. Rebecca entered the room and paused at the sight of Sophie on the floor, clutching the dress as if her life depended on it. Sophie lifted her swollen eyes, her voice choked. I never told her how much I loved her. Rebecca knelt beside her, holding her cold hands. But she knew. Sophie shook her head, unable to believe that. Silence stretched between them until Sophie finally took a deep breath, drying her swollen eyes. She looked at the unfinished dress and pressed her lips together, her mind filled with a single thought. I need to do something. Rebecca frowned. What do you mean? Sophie slowly rose, still holding the dress. I can't just go back to Greenhill and pretend nothing happened. She looked at the old sewing machine in the corner of the room. My grandmother spent her life sewing to give me a future, so I could have choices. The words trembled, but now they carried a new strength. She turned to Rebecca. I need to honor that. I need to do something that would make her proud. Rebecca smiled faintly. And what would that be? Sophie looked at the dress once more. I don't know yet, but I won't run away from my roots anymore. The silence in the room was no longer filled with sorrow. It was filled with promise. Sophie took a deep breath, feeling for the first time since her grandmother's death that maybe, just maybe, there was still something she could do to turn the pain into something greater. And in that moment, holding Margaret's last gift, She knew she would never leave her past behind again. Sophie got off the bus at the Green Hill bus station, one hand clutching her suitcase and the other carefully holding the unfinished dress. The noise of the cars, the hurried voices of people, and the bright lights of the city felt more distant than ever. She sensed that, in some way, she no longer belonged to that place. Everything felt too big, too cold, too empty. Taking a deep breath, she closed her eyes for a moment. She had no time for hesitation. There was so much to be done. She headed straight to her college dorm, where she found her belongings untouched, as if nothing had changed, but everything within her had transformed. That night, she barely slept. She spent hours gazing at the dress, running her fingers over the fabric, as if she could feel Margaret's presence there. In the morning, she began to take action. She listed every unnecessary object she owned and put them up for sale. The new computer, the clothes she bought trying to fit in, the accessories that never truly meant anything. When Andrew appeared at her door, Sophie simply looked up, unflinching. "I heard you're back," he said, crossing his arms. Sophie didn't respond immediately. She finished packing one of the boxes and then raised her head. "I'm back. Look, I know you've been through a lot, but you can't just throw yourself away like this. Walk away from everything. You studied so hard to be here." She sighed, realizing that for the first time, Andrew's words had no effect on her. "I'm not walking away. I just finally know who I am." He raised an eyebrow. "So that means you're going back to being a village girl?" Sophie offered a faint smile, but there was no joy in it. "I never stopped being one." Andrew opened his mouth to argue, but then gave up. Without another word, he turned and left. Sophie felt nothing but a light, definitive relief. With the money from selling her belongings and some donations she managed to gather, Sophie started a fund to assist underprivileged elderly people in Margaret's name. She sought support at the university, spoke with professors, and shared her story. The first time she stood in front of an audience to talk about her grandmother, her hands trembled. But then she looked at the unfinished dress beside her and knew she had to continue. For a long time, I tried to hide where I came from. I tried to fit into a place that wasn't mine, trying to be someone I never was. And in the process, I lost the person who loved me the most. The audience was in absolute silence. My grandmother sacrificed everything for me. Everything. She gave me all she had, but I didn't give anything back. I left her behind, not knowing that she was already sick, not knowing that when I left home she was already losing her strength. A lump formed in her throat, but she took a deep breath, holding steady. But I'm not here to talk about regret. I'm here to talk about love. The love she stitched into every dress she made for me. The love I took too long to see. The love that doesn't need an end. Sophie raised the unfinished dress for everyone to see. This was the last thing my grandmother sewed before she passed away, but she couldn't finish it. A murmur spread among the attendees. Sophie looked at the delicate fabric, touching the loose threads. "I'm going to finish this dress, not alone, but with the help of anyone who wants to be a part of this. Because this dress is not just a piece of cloth, it is a symbol." She looked at the first people from the assistance fund she had managed to help. Some elderly individuals were smiling, emotional, holding each other's hands. "I couldn't hear my grandmother's forgiveness while she was alive, but I will find that forgiveness by helping those in need. Stitching, stitch by stitch, the love that has no end." Silence lasted for a few moments before applause began, first softly, then louder. When Sophie realized it, the entire audience was on their feet, applauding with tears in their eyes. Rebecca was in the front row, smiling with pride. Later that night, Sophie returned to her small dorm room. She sat down in front of the sewing machine she bought with the donation money and pulled the dress closer. With careful hands, she held the needle and threaded it through the fabric. And then she began to sew. The thread of love that Margaret wove would never break. Life often teaches us the hardest lessons too late. Sophie spent years running from her past, only to realize that the greatest gift she ever had was the one she had left behind. Margaret's love was stitched into every fabric of her life, and even in death, she continued to guide her. Through her pain, Sophie found purpose, turning regret into action, grief into kindness, and love into a lasting legacy. This story reminds us that the time to appreciate those who love us is now. Don't wait until it's too late to say, "Thank you, I love you," or simply to be present. Have you ever taken someone's love for granted, only to realize its true value later? What did you think of this story? Let me know in the comments. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss another one. Don't forget to like this video and share your thoughts in the comments. And before you go, click on the next recommended video. It's another story that will move your heart. Thank you for watching, and see you in the next story.